Hello everyone and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. We're going to jump right into it today, folks, considering I have to bring my car to the dealership after my girlfriend was rear-ended yesterday. Now, thankfully, and most importantly, she wasn't hurt, but there's some damage to the back panel of my car and my taillight, so I have to bring it on over to the shop, to the body shop, and get it taken care of. Thankfully, the person who rear-ended her had insurance and was at least a quality enough human being to take responsibility for his actions. So this whole entire process is quite streamlined. And honestly, the most important thing is that nobody was hurt, but of course it becomes an inconvenience now, and I have to head over and take care of it. So with that said, we're going to jump right into our article today. The article we have is from The Spectator, and the headline is, Jeffrey Epstein really was a streak of slime. Why did so many pillars of the establishment associate with such a vile creature? The Netflix documentary offers a tantalizing answer, and this article was published June 13th in The Spectator. Did Jeffrey Epstein kill himself, or was he murdered? And frankly, who cares? Actually, having watched the 4-part Netflix series Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich, about his secretive, sordid life, I care very much. Well, you are not the only one, sir. You are not the only one, sir, Mr. James Dellingpole, the author of the article. We feel the same way, because I don't know how anyone can take a look at this case, and especially from the outside looking in, somebody who has not followed this case, take a look at all of the facts and all of the evidence and not shake your head in wonderment and ask yourself, did this guy really kill himself, or is there something else going on here? Sure, his squalid death in jail, apparently from suicide while awaiting trial for numerous sex crimes, was thoroughly deserved. But justice would have been far better served if this noisome creep had spent the rest of his days rotting in prison, deprived forever of all sexual activity, save the involuntary variety provided in the showers whenever he dropped the soap. Look, I agree with all of that. I wanted to see Jeffrey Epstein spend every last minute of his life in prison as a broken man. You strip away the power. You strip away the money, and then you strip away everything that these people are, because when it comes down to it, that's all they truly are, folks. They're their money and their power. They have nothing else. They aren't decent human beings. They aren't moral. They don't care about anybody else. They have no empathy. We're dealing with a whole bunch of narcissists, just like Dr. Stephen DeLay told us here on the program. I hadn't expected to respond quite this viscerally to the Epstein tale. And I've gotten that from a lot of people recently. A lot of people who are just getting hip to what went on. A lot of people who are just understanding the depths of exactly how deep this went. Well, people are starting to understand, and they're starting to respond. I've received so many emails from people who were just blown away by how deep this story really goes, and about how the legacy media has only just scratched the surface here, folks. Indeed, before I watched the documentary, I was inclined to think that perhaps the nefariousness had been overdone. Surely, if he were as guilty as some of his accusers claimed, he would have been put away long ago. And that's what everybody would think, right? I mean, if I was coming into this case cold and had no idea about the players in the case, or who they were, or the prosecution, or the fact that this has spanned over 4 presidents now, I would think that there is something else going on, right? I would think that he was definitely guilty and that he would definitely be in prison, but no. You start looking into the case and you start to see all of the ties that bind. You start to see how the tentacles slithered their way into many parts of society. And you start to understand that Jeffrey Epstein is not like your typical trafficking participant. There was something much deeper here. There was something much more. And anyway, the relationship between older men with money and power and younger women with aspirations has always been more complicated than the Me Too furor contrived to pretend. I don't really agree with that, to be honest with you, because there's a lot going on within the Me Too movement that it just blows me away, right? What happened with Harvey Weinstein and the fact that people feel empowered now, women feel empowered now to come out and speak against their abusers, I think that's a good thing. And I don't think that there's been too much furor around stuff like that, right? Usually when these women come forward and we're dealing with somebody sick and demented like Epstein and Weinstein, it's not just one person, right? So you can't make pretend that it's not happening, all right? It's multiple people coming out and accusing these people, and they're credible accusations. Obviously, Weinstein's in prison. Epstein was on his way. So I don't really agree with the whole the relationship between older men with money and power and younger women with aspirations has always been more complicated. Not really. All right? Not really. But that was before I learned the unutterable vileness of what Epstein did. His private retreat in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Little St. James, for example, those young girls who had to service his myriad celebrity guests weren't willing, lavishly rewarded accomplices, but the cheated, betrayed, trapped, put upon survivors of a vicious and sadistic sociopath who actually seemed to get most of his sexual kicks from the knowledge that those poor girls were hating every moment. And I like to see how Dellenpole here, I'm not too familiar with most of his work, by the way, but I like to see how Dellenpole here changes his tune after seeing what those poor girls went through and understanding that it has nothing to do with just baseless accusations or someone trying to get some money out of a rich guy. Now, of course, I've talked about that before. We see that. We see that a lot of times in our country, right? We have to follow the evidence, right? We have to believe the evidence. When somebody brings an accusation forward, we have to believe the evidence. Now, we can't just rely on the fact that, oh, well, this person's a prince, he didn't do it. Or this person's, a politician, he definitely didn't have anything to do with this. That doesn't cut it for me, right? If you're going to make accusations, I need evidence for me to believe what you have to say. And from the very beginning in this case, it has been quite evident to me that there is nothing but credible accusations all across the board. Every single one of these girls that has come forward has been nothing but credible with their telling of the story. And the craziest part is none of these gals knew each other previous to this, okay? But they all had the same story. That's a pretty big coincidence, huh? Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this documentary series, based on a book by one of his Palm Beach neighbors, the thriller writer James Patterson, was the near absence of its main character. And I think that's significant as well. I like how the Netflix documentary really shot from the perspective of the survivors. Of course, they added their own little twist to it and their own little bits of, juiciness. But mainly the story was about the survivors and what their experience with Jeffrey Epstein, how that impacted their lives. And I think that was pretty good stuff. And I think that the Netflix documentary especially really did its job, what it was supposed to do. We saw footage of him impassively, contemptuously, half-smirking, batting off questions under interrogation from police investigators, including one about whether he could confirm he had an egg-shaped penis. And we've heard numerous reports about his deformities and about that specific part of his body. And when you hear multiple reports like this and from multiple people, that's a legit question for a lawyer to ask. Is it uncomfortable? Sure. Is it embarrassing? Absolutely. Who cares, though? You think Jeffrey Epstein cared about embarrassing or if something was disgusting? No, he didn't care. So I really don't have a problem with it being brought up, right? It's part of the case and it is pertinent. So I think that when you see a line of questioning like this from a lawyer, I think that there's obviously a reason that the lawyer is going down that path and he's trying to shake Epstein's tree. But what we never saw, though it presumably must have been immense, was the captivating charm that gulled so many girls into trusting him and so many of the rich and powerful into his circle of friendship. Well, it really wasn't charm per se when it came to the girls that were being abused. Now, if we're talking about the core four, Well, I agree with that. He was like Keith Raniere in that regard. He had all of the core four wrapped around his little finger, and in return, he gave them wealth and power and access to parts of society that they could have never imagined being part of before being around Jeffrey Epstein. And the sickening part about it is how willingly all of these women, these core four, how willingly they went along with Jeffrey Epstein and how willingly they have kept his secrets for so long. Meanwhile, you have somebody like Maria Farmer who was kicking in the door in 95, 96, ringing the alarm bells, telling everybody that there was a fire, and nobody paid attention to what she had to say. All of this could have been stopped. All of it. All of these girls that were molested and abused after that time, they could have been spared all of this misery if the FBI would have just listened to what Maria Farmer was telling them. Even with all the testimony from the girls he abused, from the detectives who tried to build a case against him, and from the financier who gave him his first big break, Epstein remained an enigma. Of course he did. And what they don't like to delve into, and what I have no problem delving into, is the reason he remained an enigma is because he was being protected by his friends in the intelligence community and whichever politicians he had a dossier on. Point blank, period. This was about much more than just sex trafficking, folks. Remember, this was about blackmail. This was about power. And if you've been listening to the podcast, you know, in my opinion, that information is the most powerful currency on the planet, especially to people like this, especially to people like Epstein and his handlers. Sure, money's great, but they had more money than they could ever spend. What they didn't have is the goods on all of these politicians, all of these so-called royals, all of these academics, and anybody else that they could sink their claws into. Obviously, he was precociously bright. A physics and math whiz, recruited as a quantitative analyst by Bear Stearns. Devious and unprincipled, too. One of his former bosses recalled that he definitely appealed to us because we were running a Ponzi scheme and he could deliver results in this criminal enterprise. Look, folks, this is the root of the story of Jeffrey Epstein and money laundering. It started way back when at Bear Stearns, and what he did is he tweaked his process along the way until he had it completely ironed out and humming along like a well-oiled machine. And that is what Jeffrey Epstein really had his fingers into, and that's where he was really making his wealth. He was laundering all of that money. There was so many funky business transactions between Jeffrey Epstein, those banks, and other people that it is impossible for me to believe that the federal government does not have a forensic accountant on the scene tracing down every last transaction. Because, folks, that's how expansive this is, and that's how far it reaches. Every last transaction that was ever made by Epstein to an associate needs to be documented and needs to be looked at under a microscope. Because if anyone received money, and that money was ill-gotten, was made in an gained in an evil way, an illegal way. Well, the person who received that money is now subject to be brought into the RICO case as well. So it's important that a forensic accountant tracks down all of these transactions and finds out who benefited from ill-gotten gains. How, though, did this child of modest circumstances, dad was a park groundskeeper, accumulate his alleged billion-dollar fortune? Well, he didn't have $1 billion on the record, right? We know it was $634 million, but we also know, as I was just talking about, that he was involved in a ton of money laundering and scheming and plotting behind the scenes when it comes to financial crimes. So, in my opinion, that's where most of his money came from. One suggestion, never properly explored, perhaps because it's so hard to find evidence, no, there's plenty of evidence for it, Mr. Dellenpole, was blackmail. Epstein, one of his chief accusers, Virginia Roberts, recalled, had hidden cameras in every single one of the rooms in the New York mansion where, inter alia, he entertained Prince Andrew. He would spy on them in a control room containing a bank of screens. Presumably, he recorded everything that went on, too. Something which must have been awfully inconvenient to a lot of very high-powered people. And it wasn't just Virginia who has come out and said this. Maria said the same thing about the audio-visual room, and several other people have also stated that the whole place was wired. And from my personal experience, from going out to the Zorro Ranch in February, the whole entire front had cameras everywhere. So if it was that wired up out front, you have to think throughout his whole entire property, with all of these rich and wealthy and powerful people coming through his doors to hang out with him and be involved in his disgustingness, well, you would have to think that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and their handlers would have a field day compiling dossiers of compromising information on all of these people. Just before he died, in a final act of spite, he transferred his assets, closer to $500 million than $1 billion, to an offshore trust beyond the reach of the U.S. authorities. This was a mark of the man's loathsomeness. His final act was deliberately to ensure that his survivors would never get compensated for the indignities and psychological trauma he had inflicted on them. Yeah, well, that didn't work out so well, huh? Considering the Survivors Fund is cracking along and plugging along at such a hot pace right now. In fact, in 4 days, next Monday, it's set to go live. So that part of Jeffrey Epstein's plan was a complete bust so far. So that's one win in the check mark in the win column for the good guys, at least. There's been far and few between in this case, folks, but we're getting there. The needle is starting to move the other way, and the fact that this story is blowing up the way it is just going to further push the prosecution towards doing the right thing. Epstein was a streak of slime. This much was abundantly clear. Can we believe the story that he once paid the parents of 3 12-year-old girls to have them flown out from France so that he could have his vile way with them? I wouldn't put it past him. Look, I believe that story 100%. Again, there's nothing that Virginia Roberts has said in this case that I do not believe, especially when you know all the players in the case. What, you think that's something that Jean-Luc Brunel would be against, doing that, sending those girls to Jeffrey Epstein? We're talking about another super predator, folks. He looks at people the same way Epstein does. Certainly, there is copious evidence that he'd pay $200 a time to dozens of underage girls to come to his Florida home to give him massages and then end up effectively raping them. Like all psychopaths, he had zero moral conscience. That's for sure, right? Definitely zero moral conscience. The man operated in his own world, and all of his fellow travelers that spent time around him are just as disgusting, in my opinion. Sure, his money managed to buy a lot of expensive lawyers and a lot of science. As a result of a disgraceful plea bargain for his Florida crimes, he ended up serving not much more than a year in a low-security prison where he had his own food, his own wing, and was let out for 12 hours each day to do whatever he wished. Even so, given that his proclivities were such an open secret, it almost beggars belief that so many pillars of the establishment, from ex-President Bill Clinton downwards, were so eager to associate with a creature so crass and tainted. Yeah, that's perfectly put, because these rumors didn't just start, right? They didn't start in the late 2000s, the early 2000s. People knew what sort of disgusting man this was. People knew that he was up to something real disgusting. And everybody ignored it. Why? Because they thought their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein would benefit them in some way. And to them, in so-called polite society, that is all that matters. You don't matter. It doesn't matter that Epstein was a sex offender. All that mattered was how the relationship with Epstein would directly affect them and help them move forward up the chain inside of that disgusting group of people. There was an answer of sorts in the first episode where an art school graduate and future Epstein survivor described how at her 1995 degree show she'd sold 3 paintings almost immediately for a total of $38,000. Quite a big deal for a student. Then her dean of college, Eileen Guggenheim, came over and firmly insisted that she sell them instead at a much lower price to a couple who were great friends and benefactors of the academy. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Well, we know they're talking about Maria Farmer there, and the fact that this disgusting lady, Eileen Guggenheim, still is sitting on the board of the New York Academy of Arts is just, it skeeves me out. It is absolutely skeevy that this lady is still sitting on the board. But again, what can we expect from a place that had Jeffrey Epstein as a board member as well? Like I always say, folks, fellow travelers, Guggenheim and the rest of these co-conspirators and enablers, don't think we've forgotten about you. Don't think you're off the hook. Don't think you're going to escape the microscope. And certainly don't think you're going to escape my big fat yap, because that is never going to occur. People like Eileen Guggenheim were instrumental in making this happen. Crucial players in helping Jeffrey Epstein conduct his business. And what occurred with Guggenheim, the New York Academy of Arts, Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and everybody else involved with the abuse of Maria and Annie Farmer is just absolutely and positively some of the most disgusting situations you could possibly ever think of. Imagine the dean of a college coming over to you after you just sold 3 paintings just out of school for $38,000. And then she comes over to you and tells you, oh no, you're going to sell them to these benefactors because we told you that's what you're going to do. Imagine? And that's how they operated, folks. In their whole entire lives were consistent with the way they treated people like Maria. That's how they treated everybody, because they thought they were better than everybody, because they were sociopaths, because they wouldn't even know empathy if it fell out of a plane and landed on their head. F. Scott Fitzgerald was right. The rich really are different and really do think deep in their hearts that they are better than we are. I say that on a regular basis here on the podcast. These people, the mega rich, the ultra rich, these sort of people are the biggest problem with the planet, because guess what? They have all the money in the world, right? It's not about money to them anymore. It's all about control and power. And for them, the means always justifies the end. If you'd like to contact me, you could do that at Bobbycapucci at protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI at protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All right, everybody, we'll be back later on. Hope you all have a great day.